Good afternoon, everyone. It's just after 2 o'clock, so let's get this underway. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Alex MacDonald, and I have the pleasure of being the head of the Centre for Lifelong Learning here at the university. I'd like to start by warmly welcoming everyone to our third free public lecture from CLL, and thank you for coming along to what I have no doubt will be an informative and thought-provoking talk from someone very much in demand for his expertise and political insight. We have almost 250 people registered for this talk, and one outcome of this challenging time is the ability to cater for larger audiences through events like this via Zoom. These talks are part of our ongoing response to the current COVID crisis and represent a way of helping us to stay connected to our students during this time. You may have heard about this talk through our newsletter, The Chat, which is another way we've developed to keep you up to date with CLL's plans, as well as providing some insights of interest into other topics. As we near the start of our October term, we're delighted to report over 1,200 registrations on our daytime and evening live Zoom classes. Thanks to a quick turnaround to online delivery back in May, we've developed what we think and feedback tells us is a successful and enjoyable experience to keep students connected with their learning and crucially each other. I hope those of you that have done classes agree, and we appreciate you all sticking with us at this unsettling time. I'm delighted that today we have also been joined by the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, Professor Douglas Brodie, who will introduce Professor Curtice shortly. Douglas will shortly demit office as Dean, and after nearly 6 years in the role, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank him, as he's been a champion of CLL and has helped the Centre to raise its profile considerably within the faculty and the wider university. CLL remains fortunate in having the backing of senior officers like Douglas who fully support the life course approach to learning and recognise the importance of universities maintaining and developing learning opportunities for adults of all ages. So it's with pleasure that I hand over to Douglas to introduce Professor Curtice, who will speak for about 40 minutes. If you have questions for Professor Curtice, I'd ask that you submit those via the Q&A function you will see on your screens. This is the first time that I have done a live webinar for this number of people, so I will endeavour to pose as many questions as time allows for to John at the end of his presentation. So for now, I'll hand over to Douglas. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Alex, and good afternoon, everyone. Great to see so many people on the call today. Politics is an area of real strength at Strathclyde and has been for many years. And very much contributing to our excellent reputation in the area is the work of Professor Sir John Curtice. John, though, is unusual compared to our other professors in politics in that he commands equal respect both in the academic community but also in the wider community. Within the academic community, he has many accolades. He's, for example, has the very prestigious position of being a Fellow of the British Academy, and the numbers at events like this consistently show how widely he's respected in the wider community. I've had the pleasure of listening to him on a number of occasions. He's always stimulating, as Alex says, always thought-provoking, always worth listening to. Some years ago, John published an article entitled "Playing with Political Fire, Cameron, the Conservatives and the EU Referendum." I don't know what John plans to say today, but I wouldn't be at all surprised if some of the consequences of playing with fire are actually remarked upon and the wisdom of those decisions might come back into the fullness of the lecture. So without further ado, I'll pass over to John, and I'm sure you're in for an extremely stimulating 45 minutes.
Thank you very much, Douglas. You are quite right. I am indeed going to talk in part about the implications of Brexit, albeit in the particular issue of how it might be interacting with the independence debate. So as you can see, I've got slides. I'm afraid that's still compulsory from talks from me, and Zoom does make that possible, and at least it means you don't have to stare at my face for 40 minutes. What essentially I want to do, I mean, I think doubtless all of you are aware that opinion polls in recent weeks and months have been indicating that there seems now to be a majority who say that they would vote yes in a second independence referendum, And this has certainly caused quite a lot of media interest and excitement, and indeed has now quite clearly caught the attention of the UK government, which is, was at least using the summer at least to send some ministers north to lead the unionist response. What I want to do in this talk is to give you some idea as to why I think this has happened. And in doing that, this does indeed, will take us back to Brexit, as to how the character of public attitudes towards independence has changed since 2014. And so I'm here not so much interested in kind of saying, well, you know, in support for independence is up or is down, although that is part of the story, but actually trying to give you some insight as to what's been going on. And also perhaps some insight into the fact that what has now become the focus of headlines is actually something that's been evident in public opinion polls, certainly for the last year or so. But let me just begin with a little bit of history. What I'm showing you here is a summary of the responses that people have given to a question that the Scottish Social Attitude Survey, which I'm heavily involved in, has asked pretty much every year since the advent of the Scottish Parliament back in 1999. And it essentially divides folk into three. The orange line are the people who said that Scotland should have its own parliament, but within the framework of the United Kingdom. The blue line are those who said that Scotland should become an independent country. And the grey line are those who have said, no, we shouldn't have a parliament at all. And they're obviously now, and for the most part, always have been a relatively small group. It's the other two groups in which we are interested. There are many interesting things about all this, and certainly one of the things you might note, for example, is that neither the advent of the SNP coming into power for the first time in 2007, that was not accompanied by any marked increase in support for independence. Indeed, at 24%, it was rather low in that year. And indeed, for much of the period when the SNP were in power until the independence referendum campaign took off, if anything, it looked as though support for independence was on the low side, and that indeed, perhaps now that there was an SNP administration in Edinburgh, who, shall we say, were rather more robust in the way in which they dealt with the UK government, perhaps was persuading people in Scotland you don't need to have independence so long as you've got somebody batting for you in Edinburgh. But then, of course, eventually, as a result of the fact that the SNP did get an overall majority in the 2011 Scottish Parliament election, the way was eventually paved by the UK government with a view to holding a referendum. And I think there's little doubt that the motivation on the UK government side was they looked at figures like this and they said, well, okay, let's let them have their referendum. It's pretty clear that we will win. And if we win and when we win decisively, this will finally put this argument to bed. Well, on the right-hand side, you will see how successful that strategy proved to be. So note, this is not a question that is simply asking people whether they vote yes or no. So you don't get quite the same distribution of answers. But as you can see, basically during the course of the referendum campaign, support for independence rose. And on this measure, even just shortly afterwards, we were up to 39%. And as you can also see, what's been true of the 2016 and 2017 surveys is that, you know, support for independence was now matching that for devolution. And that certainly 2 points to make. One is that the long-term consequence of holding the 2014 referendum was to end up with a marked increase in support for independence that seemed to last beyond the referendum. And to that extent, at least, the long-term consequence of the referendum seemed to make Scotland's position within the UK more problematic rather than being assured. And indeed, if we look at polling data, asking people between the 2014 independence referendum and the 2016 EU referendum, which is what this slide is showing. So this is now simply showing yes or no. Blue is yes, green is no. Essentially, as you can see, most polls showing no ahead, but not by much. And basically, if you try to put a summary through that, it's obviously a couple of parallel lines with no narrowly ahead. And essentially, therefore, on the one hand, it's not clear that support for independence was rising beyond what it was in September 2014, but equally also, it was by no means clear that the gain in support that the yes side managed to achieve during the course of the referendum campaign was in any way being dissipated. So that was the position that we seemed to be at when along came another David Cameron referendum, viz. The EU referendum. And of course, on this you'll be familiar, is that the outcome in Scotland was very different from that in England and Wales. In England and Wales, a narrow lead of around 53 to 47% in favour of leave. In Scotland, however, almost 2 to 1 in favour of remain. And certainly for those on the nationalist side of the argument, I think they certainly anticipated that the consequence of this would be to result in an increase in support for independence, because from their perspective at least, there arguably was no better demonstration of a long-standing argument that they have pursued, which is that for so long as Scotland remains part of the United Kingdom, it is always at risk of having its democratic wishes, quote unquote, overturned by the rather different views of voters south of the border. However, actually, the politics of the 2016 referendum north of the border were a little more complicated than that, because actually attitudes towards whether or not the United Kingdom should remain or leave inside the European Union cut across both the yes and the no coalitions that were assembled in 2014. And indeed, note in particular that around 1 in 3 of those people who had voted yes in 2014 went on to vote leave in 2016. It's long been the case that there's always been an element of nationalist support in Scotland that has taken the view that what's the point of liberating ourselves from London only to put ourselves into chains from Brussels. And so therefore it wasn't necessarily clear, even if people were to react to the European Union referendum and to change their views about Scotland's constitutional position in the light of that, that the gains would necessarily all be in one direction. Yes, there clearly is a substantial body of Remain voters, around 3 in 5 of them, who had voted Remain, and they might be upset about Scotland being required to leave the European Union, but equally they might be matched by voters going in the opposite direction. And certainly one of the things that we discovered, if we look at the polls again on support for yes or no, basically for the first 2 years after the EU referendum. So I'm now taking you through here basically until the beginning of the last calendar year, January 2019. As you can see, no still tend to be consistently ahead of yes. There was just a small number of polls. You'll see this on the far left-hand side of the graph, a small number of polls saying that yes, we're ahead. But this immediately after the referendum, but this very rapidly disappeared. And the truth is that despite the nationalist expectation, therefore, it was not clear that actually was proving to be beneficial to those on the yes side of the argument. And indeed, some quite useful polling done by YouGov back in the autumn of 2016 showed what was going on. So what I'm showing you here is how in the autumn of 2016, people, so let's just take the left-hand side first. People here, the first column, these are the folk who voted yes and remain, and 86% of them in the autumn of 2016 were saying, yeah, we would vote yes again. But amongst those yes voters who voted leave, the proportion was down to 65%. And equally and conversely, on the no side, 93% of no voters who voted leave said that they would vote no again, but that proportion fell to around 3/4 of those who had voted remain. So voters were reacting, despite the fact that in the aggregate, the level of support for yes and no was unchanged. Underneath the surface, the Brexit debate was shifting people, albeit shifting people in both directions. And as a result of that, a divide was actually opening up in the independence debate between the, according to people's views about the European Union. And you can see how this opens out here, using again Scottish social attitudes and going back to even before the independence referendum. Now, to do this, I can't use whether people say they vote remain or leave, but I have another question which I can use to divide people into whether they're Eurosceptics, that means they either wanted to get out of the European Union, or were at least wanting to reduce the European Union's powers, versus those who were at least happy with the status quo and might even want a more powerful European Union. You may well remember that we spent hours arguing in the 2014 independence referendum about whether or not an independent Scotland would or would not be able to be a continuing member of the European Union if it became an independent country. And even President Barroso, the then President of the European Commission, made one or two well-known interventions into that debate. Well, if this was one of those occasions when the politicians actually didn't have their pulse on where the public were at, because actually that debate at the end of the time proved to be a complete irrelevance, because as you can see here, and you might also guess and already shown you, whether or not you were a Eurosceptic or a Europhile made no difference to whether or not you were in favour of independence. And the same was true in 2015, after the referendum. But notice that in 2016, where we were polling and interviewing people after the EU referendum, a gap begins to open up. Europhiles more likely to be in favour of independence than Eurosceptics, and that divide opens up even more in 2017. And we can see this equally if we look at how people said they would vote in a referendum. So again, the same division between Eurosceptics and Europhiles, but now looking at how people say which side people would vote on, rather than using the more complicated question on people's attitudes towards independence. In the referendum, Eurosceptics just as likely to vote yes as Europhiles. But after 2016, Europhiles are much more clearly pro-yes, and that opens up a bit further. And as long ago as 2017, it was very clear that a majority of Remain voters in Scotland were in favour of independence. This change, by the way, also had implications for the character of party support, and actually casts a lot of light on the fate of the SNP in the 2017 UK general election, when their support fell from 50% down to, what was it, around 37% or so. This is breaking down support for the parties in 2015, the 2016 Scottish Parliament election, and the 2017 UK election, according to whether or not people voted Remain or Leave. 2 points to note. First, how the rise in support for the Conservatives is very heavily concentrated amongst Leave voters. And the revival of the Conservative Party in Scotland, particularly in 2017, owes very little to the debate about independence and a great deal to the fact that the party was now winning over the relatively niche market of Leave voters in Scotland, and notice what happens to the SNP. The SNP was almost as popular amongst Leave voters as it was amongst Remain voters back in the 2015 general election, but by 2017 it was markedly less popular. And much of the SNP loss of support, not all of it, but much of it, is to be accounted for by the way in which the Brexit divide was reshaping attitudes in Scotland. And therefore, yes, in the short run, actually, Brexit was proving to be more disruptive for those on the nationalist side of the argument than it was for those on the unionist side. Underpinning this, by the way, also was a change of perspective on one of the central issues in the debate about independence, which is what its economic consequences would be, because of course, once we are talking about a choice between a Scotland that might rejoin the European Union and a United Kingdom that's on its way out, then you might regard the economic implications of independence rather differently than as was the case in 2014 when you were talking about a United Kingdom that was still inside the European Union. If you are doubtful about the economic consequences of Brexit, you may become somewhat less doubtful about the economic consequences of independence. And again, what you will notice back in 2014, Eurosceptics and Europhiles, pretty similar in their views about the economics of independence, and in both cases they were on balance negative. In 2017, in contrast, Europhiles in particular, more of them are optimistic about the economic consequences of Brexit than they are pessimistic. But then let me take you beyond 2017. So this is back to looking at all of the opinion polls that ask people how they vote in a referendum, leaving aside the don't knows. The left-hand side of this diagram repeats the right-hand side of the last version of this that I showed you. So this is showing you what was the position during 2018, with no still basically at 55 and yes at 45. It was then quite a long gap. But then notice the polls that are being asked during 2019. During 2019, clearly and consistently, although no in most polls was still ahead, the gap was much narrower. And if you take actually the average of all of the polls conducted in Scotland between April 2019 and polling day for the UK general election, on average it was yes 49, no 51. And that's why I said to you earlier, this actually now is a well-established trend. This is a story of change that's been in evidence for quite some time. This then frankly becomes 50-50 by the time we get to Brexit Day at the beginning of this year. And then on the right-hand side, you will begin to see the more recent polls that have caused the media headlines, where we've now had 7 opinion polls in a row, all of them conducted during the coronavirus lockdown and pandemic, with yes ahead. And we're currently running on an average of around yes 53, no 47. Well, I'm going to come to the far right-hand side in a while. For now, I want to try and explain what's going on. And why is it that although Brexit had reshaped the character of support for independence, it hadn't appeared to change the aggregate level of support, but why that last bit was no longer the case? Well, here we go. This is again taking the opinion polls, but dividing the level of support for independence, registering them from 2018 through to more recently, amongst separately amongst Remain and Leave voters. So the blue bars are the level of support for yes amongst Remain voters, the orange bars amongst Leave voters. And what you will notice is that, and I want you to ignore the far right-hand side for the moment, but if we just go from the first column to the fourth column, what you will notice is that if anything, support for Brexit, sorry, for independence amongst Leave voters edges down from 2018 through to 2020. In contrast, support for independence rises very clearly in 2019 amongst Remain voters, and it remains steady thereafter. In other words, all of the increase in support for independence that has been registered in the polls since the spring of last year has occurred amongst Remain voters, and that whereas hitherto, basically for every no Remain voter who'd switched to yes, there had been a yes Leave voter who had switched to no. No longer were the terms of trade equal, but rather Remain voters will now have continued to go in favour of yes in greater numbers, and that was now shifting the aggregate level of support. And basically, therefore, one of the things that has to be understood whatever your views and your preferences about either the Union or about the European Union, is that it's been pretty clear for quite some time that the pursuit of Brexit by the UK government has undermined support for the Union. You might like that not to be the case. You might believe that it's perfectly fair for Scotland to be having to leave the European Union along with the rest of the UK, that the United Kingdom is whole and entire. But I'm afraid if that is your view, you do have to understand that now a crucial proportion of your fellow Scottish citizens do not necessarily share that view, and you therefore have to think about how you counteract, if that's what you want to do, that perspective that has been adopted. But then, of course, the interesting thing on the far right-hand side is that the most recent increase in support for independence has taken on a rather different character. The most recent increase in support for independence has occurred just as much, if anything slightly more, amongst Leave voters as it does amongst Remain voters. So it's gone up further amongst Remain voters. There is still the gap between them and Leave voters, but support amongst Leave voters has gone back up, which suggests that the most recent increase is not about Brexit, but most likely is about the other issue that's dominated all of our lives in the last 6 months, i.e. that it is to do with the coronavirus perspective. And as you can now see, just to underline the point, how, again, this is similar analysis I showed you before from YouGov. Now, 95% of people who voted yes and Remain would vote yes again amongst Leave voters. Amongst no voters, in contrast, the proportion of no voters who would vote the same way who vote to Remain is now down to 70%. And meanwhile, yes voters who voted Leave have fallen away. But the crucial point, of course, at the end of the day, is that there are nearly twice as many Remain voters as are Leave voters. So although basically the rates of transfer are very similar amongst Remain and Leave voters, because there are more Remain voters than Leave voters, the terms of trade are disadvantageous to those on the no side. And then also notice, in terms of what's going on, how also in December 2019, the support for the Conservatives was holding up amongst Leave voters. That Leave Remain divide now very stark so far as the Conservative vote is concerned. And you know, the SNP has, however, made quite substantial gains amongst Remain voters, less so amongst Leave voters. So the SNP, in recovering in 2019, is doing so on the back of being the principal Remain party now in Scotland. This is a fundamental change in the character of SNP support. And whereas the Labour Party is the principal Remain party south of the border, in Scotland, the Labour Party is not able to eat heavily into that vote. That's one of its problems. It's the SNP which is now articulating the anti-Brexit position north of the border. Okay, so why might we think that coronavirus is playing an important role? Well, the first thing I think we have to understand and acknowledge is that although we've spent many a happy year debating the supposedly iconic public policies of free personal care, free university tuition, free prescriptions, etc., in truth, all of that has been relatively small beer as compared with what's happened in the last 6 months. The coronavirus pandemic has been the biggest public policy challenge facing the devolved institutions in 21 years. it has catapulted devolution into being a UK-wide subject and subject of debate because of the fact, of course, that a health service and public health are both devolved responsibilities across the whole of the UK, and therefore much of what we have and haven't been able to do in the last 6 months has been decided not by Boris, but by Nicola. So this has been crucial. I think it's therefore reasonable to anticipate that if voters have different perspectives on the relative competence of the UK and the Scottish governments in handling the pandemic, then this might well indeed influence people's attitudes more widely. And certainly on the question of whether or not people view the two governments and the two prime stroke first ministers differently, the answer to that is undoubtedly yes. Here are but 3 examples whereby both in May and in July and in August, somewhere around 3/4 of people think that Nicola Sturgeon has handled COVID-19 well, and amongst Boris Johnson, if anything, the numbers have got worse, and now we've almost got the mirror image so far as people's evaluations of him are concerned. We can go into the Q&A as to why this might be the case. I don't want to get involved in that now. For the purpose of this argument, the fact that for whatever reason people view the performance differently is arguably what is crucial. And indeed, even, this is an example from YouGov, who have asked the same question more than once, as you can see, whereas back in April, the UK government was at least 50-50 as to whether people thought it was handling well or badly. Now it really is the obverse of people's perception of the Scottish government. And the Scottish government has not lost any ground at all during the course of the pandemic in people's evaluations of how well it's been doing. And in the wake of that, Nicola Sturgeon's broader public popularity, this is simply asking people how well or badly she is doing, is now back, and it's the blue line here that's crucial. These are the people who think that she's doing well. And as you can see, Nicola Sturgeon, in the most recent reading from YouGov, is back to almost the level of popularity that she enjoyed back in the autumn of 2015 when she first became First Minister, and when she was an amazing box office success in being able to fill the Hydro and a number of other large venues in Scotland. And this isn't just simply those folk who are yes voters and SNP supporters saying that Nicola Sturgeon is capable of walking on water. Just, for example, look at the views of those who voted Leave and those who voted No, and how they compare both Sturgeon and Johnson. Leave voters, okay, they scored Johnson at 50-50 in July, but they put Sturgeon at 60% for doing things well. And amongst No voters, Boris is in negative territory, Nicola Sturgeon is in positive territory. So amongst those group of voters whom unionists badly need to keep on side, perceptions of the relative competence of the two governments are operating in the Scottish government's favour. That still leaves the question, well, would this necessarily affect people's views about independence? Well, a couple of pieces of evidence as to why it might be. One is a question here in which people were being asked, well, has the handling of COVID by the Scottish and UK governments made you, in the case of the Scottish government, more confidence of independence, and in the case of the UK government, more confidence of the union? And as you can see, Leave voters and No voters inclined, if anything, to the view, frankly, maybe Scotland could govern itself. Leave voters and No voters saying, I'm not quite so sure that the UK government has been quite up to it. And something even more directly, people being asked, well, do you think an independent Scotland would have handled coronavirus better or worse? It's over 2-1 in general, but it's not the public in general that matters. It's the difference between yes and no voters. Virtually no yes voters think that coronavirus would have been handled worse. Their faith in the independence project has not been shaken by what's happened in the last 6 months. In contrast, 20% of no voters say that they think that Scotland would have handled coronavirus better. So it certainly looks very strong circumstantial evidence that for some voters, at least, the conclusion that they have drawn from the coronavirus pandemic is that, well, and is that actually they've become somewhat more likely to be convinced of another nationalist argument, long-standing argument, which is that an independent Scotland would be better able to govern itself than its part of the UK. Now, of course, much of the argument that we've been having as this debate's taken off again has been about, well, but hang on, the SNP said this was, I think there were, at least their claim is, the 2014 referendum was a once in a lifetime opportunity and they should keep their promises, etc. So what do voters now think about holding another referendum? This is not the easiest question to understand, but it's a question that's been asked regularly. It's asked people, you know, should there be a referendum in the next 2 or 3 years while the UK is negotiating the EU? Maybe 2 or 3 years later than now after Brexit's sorted, or there shouldn't be one at all. And let's just look at the red line, which is there shouldn't be one at all. Around 2018, when the SNP initially tried to go for a referendum, and then in the wake of the 2017 election pulled up the white flag, it's pretty clear that on balance, people in Scotland didn't think there should be another referendum. But you will notice as we move towards the right-hand side of the graph, and more recently, we're back to a position where no more than 50% of people say there shouldn't be a referendum. And if we ask now the more specific question, which is whether or not there should be a referendum in the next 5 years, which will be the proposition, I think that's put before the Scottish public in May of next year. As you can see from looking at the blue line, there are now rather more people who say there should than say that there shouldn't. And also when the YouGov asked the specific question as to whether there should be a referendum if the SNP win an overall majority next year, slightly more people are in favour than against. We shouldn't be surprised because the honest truth is all this argument about process is but a substitute for the argument about principle. This is just an example from a poll done last autumn. And I just want to show you, 86% of people in this poll said that there should be another independence referendum if they were yes voters, and 92% of no voters expressed their opposite view. In other words, when people answer the question about whether there should be a referendum or not, basically yes voters say there should, no voters say there should not, and we should not now be surprised that there is a small majority in favour of having another referendum, because there is now a small majority in favour of having, of there being yes. So just finally, however, and I'm going to skip this, just a couple of other final observations. Just to point out in particular that none of this is to say that everything is necessarily rosy on the nationalist side of the argument. Here, remind you again, going back to the issue of the economic consequences of independence, YouGov quite handily earlier this year asked people whether or not they thought Scotland would be better off or worse off as a result of independence. And if you compare the first trio of columns with the second trio, you will basically see, and the second trio is how people answered in September 2014, very shortly before polling day. Actually, the balance of opinion according to this has not changed, though it will be interesting to see what is the position now some 6 months on. And again, as you might anticipate, however, Remain voters are rather more optimistic than our Leave voters. But the economic argument is arguably one still to be won or lost, though notice that if you ask people both whether Brexit would be good or bad for Scotland's economy and whether independence would be good or bad, the blue line show people's views about Brexit, and the orange line here, this is more recent, what they said about independence, then actually people are rather more likely to be pessimistic about the economic consequences of Brexit than they are independence. Second, obviously, issue is the currency debate, on which the SNP have changed their position. They now eventually want an independent Scotland to sign up to a separate currency. Well, here's the rub. Irrespective of whether a yes voter or a no voter, you want to hang on to the pound. And to that extent, at least, this is still an issue on which the SNP have quite a lot of ground of persuasion to do. That all of us said, what are the prospects for May of next year? And I think certainly, we're not going to have a referendum unless there is a pro-independence majority in Holyrood, and we're probably not even going to have one unless there's an SNP majority at Holyrood. But at the moment, at least, the SNP are well ahead. These are all the polls of constituency voting intentions since 2016. And as you can see, the other line, top line, SNP now running over 50%, and they would be heading to an even bigger majority than in May 2011. And if that does happen, then the UK government will face a somewhat difficult situation. And crucially here, and there is a neat irony here, the reason at the end of the day why the Conservative Party won the 2019 UK election was because they were able to unite the Leave vote behind them. 75% or so of Leave voters voted for the Conservatives. The Remain vote, in contrast, was fragmented. Actually, fewer voters voted for pro-Leave parties than voted for pro-second referendum parties in the election, but because of the differential concentration of the vote, it was the Leave side what won it. Well, when it comes to the debate on the constitutional question in Northern Ireland, what we have is a situation where the yes vote is very heavily concentrated behind the SNP. Basically, over 4 in 5 of yes voters are saying they're going to vote for the SNP. In contrast, the Remain vote is fragmented. So if Boris Johnson understands the real reason why he won the 2019 election, which was by being able to corral the Leave vote, he will understand the difficulty his party faces in next year's Scottish Parliament election, because at the moment at least it is not corralling the Unionist vote, and it faces a nationalist vote that is much more concentrated than the Leave vote ever was in the debate about Brexit. So the Prime Minister should at least understand the position that he is in, even if getting out of it might be rather more difficult. I don't propose to repeat all of this. This is essentially a summary of what I've said. But essentially, the crucial point is that we can speculate about whether or not the seeming advantage that the Scottish Government and the nationalist movement are currently seeming to derive out of the coronavirus pandemic, and obviously it may well be that perceptions on that change. We may well take the view that a lot of the change that's happened has occurred in a vacuum. We've not really been debating independence in the last 6 months, or indeed the last 2 years. And maybe when we have the debate again, attitudes will shift. But I think Brexit is not going to go away. And I think it's pretty clear that Brexit has undermined the Unionist position north of the border. And to that extent, at least, any referendum in the immediate future does look as though it's going to be more difficult for the Unionist side to fight than was the referendum back in 2014.
Thank you very much for that interesting, thought-provoking and incredibly full analysis of where we are at the moment as a country. I'd just like to say at this point that we are recording this session, and there was a lot of information there to take in. We will be putting that up on CLL's website over the next couple of days once we've got a transcription of the talk done. So if you want to revisit that at any point, you can, and equally you can tell friends, family, and other diaspora about that if they wish to have a look themselves, or you wish to watch again. So there, in terms of questions, I have some questions that have come in from the audience, and the first one of these, if I can put this to John, is and it's an interesting one about demography. How representative are the samples polled by YouGov across the entire demographic, and what policies are in place to ensure there's fair sampling around this?
Ah, right, there's a big question. I mean, all opinion polling these days is being done over the internet, and it's being done amongst people who in some way or another have been volunteered, stroke persuaded, stroke cajoled into signing up and saying, I am willing to take part in your surveys. And I think everybody would acknowledge that as a result, they do tend to consist disproportionately of people with an interest in, not necessarily in politics, because you can do surveys well beyond politics, but a variety of other things. The upside of that approach, however, is that they know a great deal about the people who sign up, because if you sign up to YouGov or to any other polling company, you have to say how old you are and your gender, and including lots of things about your attitudes towards politics, etc., etc. So that does mean that, therefore, I mean, all survey research relies to some degree on weighting the data so that it looks representative, and this is certainly important. The data from Scottish Society is collected rather differently. That's collected face to face, and it's collected from a random probability sample. There's no way you can volunteer for that. And I just simply invite you to note that Scottish Social Attitudes picks up much the same broad trends that have the commercial opinion polls, which have been primarily relying on. The other thing to say, and again, this is one thing that's been interesting recently. Now, for a little while, we were going, well, actually, it's only panel-based that's been polling north of the border. All of this increase most recently has simply come from there. Will other companies replicate it? Well, we've now had 4 different polling companies who have all come up with much the same figure. And to that extent, at least, I think, and what's also true, and again, when you're looking at opinion polls, I mean, it's not just the levels of interest, it's the structure. All of the opinion polls are showing exactly the same structure. So that story of how the increase in support last year is exclusively amongst Remain voters, it's in every opinion poll. The fact that this year, all the polls are showing an increase in support amongst Remain and Leave voters, it's in every opinion poll. So, now, I mean, I think what I would say straight away is that when opinion polls say to you, well, you know what, it's about 53-47, what they're really saying to you is, well, it's probably true that the yes side have a bit better chance of winning, but, it's pretty close to 50-50. It's not guaranteed, even leaving aside the campaign. And sure, anybody who does polling will be aware that, well, maybe they're slightly too pro-yes, etc., etc. Maybe the true figure is 51-49. All that has to be acknowledged. What I think you cannot get away from are the 2 things I was trying to emphasize. One is the changed structure of support for independence, and 2, the fact that it is higher. You might still, if you're on the Union side, hope that it's not quite as high yet as the polls said, but I think you should limit your hopes at that, and you should engage in realism so far as the rest of what I said in the course this afternoon.
Thank you. The questions are coming in thick and fast now, and I'm aware we've only got about 7 minutes or so remaining. So just to cover another one, interested to know if you knew if there was any movement between the categories of Eurosceptic and Europhile, given that the UK government messaging at the moment and for a while has been that the EU are behaving in bad faith.
Yes, I mean, I'm going to report on this in something next month. I mean, 2 points to make. Although Scotland voted heavily to remain, it's not clear that Scotland, that every Remain voters is kind of fully signed up to a highly integrated European Union. There is quite, so Scotland, it's gone up and down. Scotland became much more Eurosceptic in the second decade of the 21st century than it was in the first decade, and that fits a UK-wide pattern. But primarily by people saying, well, maybe nice if the European Union was a bit less powerful. It's begun to show signs of moving back in the opposite direction. But when you get to Eurosceptic, Europhile, it's still something like a 50-50 split. But interestingly, despite all of that, we're still finding that there's sufficient Remain voters who are sufficiently upset to tilt the numbers. But I think we should remember, even the SNP's vision of European Union membership is a fairly semi-detached one. If it could reduce the impact of the European Union on fishing, it would. It doesn't want to be in the Euro. It doesn't want to be in the Schengen Agreement. It would still quite fancy having a bit of a rebate, thank you very much. Shall we say the SNP's vision of European Union membership is not dissimilar to that which dominated the Conservative Party until relatively recently.
Okay, thank you. Just going to fire through some more of these. Economic issues still a massive challenge for the SNP. However, does the Brexit result not show that it's not necessarily about economics, it's about taking back control?
Yeah, sure. I mean, that obviously is one of the interesting things as to whether or not the experience of Brexit and the experience of coronavirus will outplay what happens to the economics. I mean, that said, I think what's also going to be true is that any referendum is going to take place the other side of Brexit. What does or doesn't prove to be the economic consequences of Brexit will be crucial, and indeed also how quickly the UK does manage to get out of the economic consequences of the pandemic will also be crucial. And there's a lot of water to flow under a lot of bridges. I mean, if you're on the Union side of the argument, what you have to hope for is that indeed the Oxford vaccine does prove to be highly efficacious, that we know that by Christmas, such that by the time we get to next May's election, at least a significant proportion of the population has been vaccinated. And as a result of all of that, the economy has turned around, and Boris will be able to say the power of the British Union has saved us all from the consequences of the pandemic. And don't underestimate his ability to sell that message. Equally, if that doesn't happen, and if we get queues at the border, Dover and Calais, and shortages in the food shops and all the rest of it, it could go very badly in the other direction.
Okay. Maybe we've got time for a couple final ones. Just one around an interesting one around the well-being piece, talking about financial benefits of an independent Scotland, still not polling high, but is there room for a question or thought around the happiness and I guess well-being of citizens of an independent Scotland, regardless of economics?
That's an interesting approach. I'm afraid it's not something that I or anybody else has followed, I'm afraid.
Yes, it's difficult to measure well-being.
No, that's another whole debate, yeah.
Question around defence. The research covered government and economics and health. What about the impact of independence and/or Brexit on defence?
Yeah, I mean, that obviously was one of the issues in 2014. I expect we could restore again. Basically, when we were looking at this, back before the independence referendum, I mean, basically, Scotland is somewhat more anti-nuclear than is England and Wales, but not as strongly as many people on the yes side would like to think. And yes, I think we can, as I said, this is one of the reasons we have to say that, a lot of things that we were going to argue about have not been debated recently. I think we can expect that argument to reassert itself. But of course, equally those on the national side of the argument will keep on reminding people about Iraq, etc., etc. So I think we can probably expect that argument to be replayed.
Okay, and just maybe one final question. would Keir Starmer be wise to embrace a federal Scotland?
Well, I think the honest truth is that those people who think that they're in favour of a federal Scotland need to find a way of A, coming up with a policy platform that is credible, and B, popularising it. I think the Scottish Labour Party has been in favour of federalism for at least the last 3 years. It's made no progress on it. The difficulty, however, is that strictly speaking, federalism implies a not dissimilar set of devolution of powers across the UK as a whole. And the difficulty is that it's not clear that England is interested. And the devolution debate in England is a very different debate. It's a debate about devolution to local government. It's not about devolving legislative powers, etc. So England, I think, is the obstacle. More broadly, however, I certainly think that the Labour Party have made a mistake in saying no absolutely to another referendum. I think this is one issue where John McDonnell got it right, that the sensible position for the Labour Party is to be willing to support a referendum if a majority of people vote in favour, because that might enable, at the end of the day, the unionist side are almost undoubtedly only going to be able to deny the SNP a majority next year if the Labour Party can take votes off the SNP. Because the Conservatives are now so dependent on Leave voters, they will struggle to win over many voters from the SNP. The Labour Party, in contrast, because they're on the same side of the Brexit debate, and because many SNP voters are ex-Labour voters, they've got a better chance of winning them over. And you look at the turnover of votes in the 2019 general election, a lot of turnover between Labour and the SNP in both directions, much less between Tory and the SNP. And I think if the Labour Party wishes to win over Labour, so Boris Johnson needs Keir Starmer to do well next May. And I'm not sure that Keir Starmer has made the right choice if he's going to do well next May. I think he needs a more nuanced position that says, yes, I'm against independence, fine, although a significant proportion of Labour voters are in favour. But I think he needs to be willing to accept that perhaps there should be a referendum if indeed a majority vote for the SNP. Okay.
Well, thank you. I'm afraid that's all the questions we have time for this afternoon. I've got through most of them. Helpfully, an audience member has provided me with a nice round off for you. So not a question, just a heartfelt thanks to Professor Sir John Curtice for a wonderful exposition on the complexities of Scottish politics. I couldn't have put that better myself. So thank you very much. It would be remiss of me to not just mention that there are plenty of opportunities for classes still open if you want to check out our website and such like. The next edition of our newsletter will be with you on the 7th of October, and in that it will feature some talks from our Learning Later Life Students Association. So just remains for me again to thank Professor Curtice very much on behalf of the Centre for Lifelong Learning, the University, and on behalf of all those attending today. So thank you very much for your time, and we look forward to seeing you again at our next public lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex.